So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School, the School of Social Sciences here at City College. And I want to welcome you to a conversation about the recent article in City Journal by our colleague, Dan DiSalvo. CUNY's future is key to New York's future. It has been almost a year since the pandemic sent all of CUNY and most of higher education off campuses to remote learning. Professionally speaking, I think for many of us, and certainly for our students, it has been among the most difficult years we've faced. There is no question, there is still good news, and there's lots of good things happening during this difficult year for our colleagues and one another, and certainly good news for and from our students. But by and large, this has just been a very hard year, a year of challenges, of loss, of uncertainty, and we're still in it, and it's hard on everybody. It's been a tough year on the institution as well, for CCNY and for CUNY. The pandemic has challenged enrollments, it has exposed weaknesses, and even more, it has created an uncertainty in state revenues that has led to cuts and to threats of more cuts to our core operating budget. The faculty, staff, and administrators that are here today know that we have had regular opportunities to come together to discuss the cuts and the possibility of more cuts. But we have had too few chances to step back and to discuss together how to put City College and CUNY on a stronger path, to think about bigger questions about the essential role of public higher education and of CUNY in particular in New York City. It's hard to think strategically, and it can be hard to even dream about a better future for our institution when we're in the depths of a crisis, but we should. And Dan DiSalvo has done just that in the recent article that is the basis for today's event. As Dan writes, quote, arguably the most diverse institution of higher education in the United States, if not the world, CUNY is vital to New York City's long-term civic and economic health. So how do we maintain that vitality and plan for a better future? Dan shares ideas. I'm grateful he is with us today to discuss them. As many of you know, Dan DiSalvo is professor and chair of political science here at the Colin Powell School. He is also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. His scholarship focuses on American political parties, elections, labor unions, state government, and public policy. He is a prolific author, including 2 books and many articles. Our colleague, Bobby Derival, is the executive director of the Colin Powell School's Masters in Public Administration, MPA program, and he has been kind enough to agree to moderate today's discussion. Bobby has been at City College for just 9 months. He began in his job in April. He has never really been able to go to campus or to sit in his office. Nevertheless, something that I learned very early on about Bobby is that he understands this place, and he believes in its mission and its purpose, and he's really understood it since before he even arrived. And he has a transformational mindset, a sense for what's possible, and a sensitivity for how we could get there, which is why I'm particularly grateful that he's agreed to moderate today's event. This is the second in what will be a series of conversations that the Colin Powell School is planning about the future of CUNY and public higher education. I want to thank everybody for being with us. Bobby's going to moderate a discussion for the next 30 or 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A period. And my colleague, Debbie Chang, who is our Director of Fellowships and Public Service Partnerships, is going to assist in the Q&A period. Please feel free to use the chat space anytime during the course of today's discussion. Debbie will pull questions from there when we get to Q&A.
Thank you.
Lastly, we are recording the conversation. So for those who can't be with us, they'll be able to get the recording. We have muted everyone, or I can hear some folks, so we are muting everyone. And with that, thanks again for being with us. Let me turn it over to Bobby and to Dan.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So again, Andy, thank you very much for the introduction. Dan, thank you for kind of being a part of this conversation and for your piece in the City Journal and your willingness to hold space for this important and critical conversation. Also, a quick thank you to our audience for being here and being part of our conversation. It is my firm belief that a prerequisite for good dialogue is participation. So as Andy has said prior, we encourage you to use the chat, share your comments and questions. And keep your comments respectful to honor the space that we are building together. We hope to include as much of your comments and your inquiries in our discussion later on in the Q&A portion. For those of you who do not know me, as Andy mentioned, I'm a relatively new member to the CCNY family. One thing I will say is that I am often left in awe and truly inspired by the experiences of our students, faculty, and staff. The virtual world has been a hard adjustment, and still our community overcomes, and in spite of the circumstances, finds new ways to achieve. Central to the MPA program's mission is an essential question. What can we do as civically engaged citizens to ensure that our world is more equitable, that it meets the challenges of not just the moment, but the challenges of the future? And how do we engage each other in honest dialogue and robust exchange to put forth ambitious agendas that meet the needs of the whole people? The obvious context of this discussion is a very real and scary budget challenge facing CUNY specifically and our city and state at large, all resulting from the pandemic's economic and health impacts. One undercurrent to that context is the divestment of public dollars that fund our critical institutions. Dan, I think that your piece insightfully presents the tension of where we are now and where we can be. And in the piece, you do state, just as Andy had quoted previously, that CUNY is arguably the most diverse institution of higher education in the United States. And you later on state that CUNY's only salvation is to reduce its dependence on state funding, just as the nation's most successful public universities started doing long ago. But how to do that amid a pandemic is a major challenge. For the folks in the audience who have not read your piece, can you talk a little bit about what makes a place like City College such an engine for social mobility?
Well, thanks, Bobby, for kicking us off and for agreeing to do this event. I want to certainly encourage our students in political science and other students at the college to take a look at the MPA program that you're running. And I want to thank Dean Rich for inviting me to do this event. So I'm honored and flattered, and certainly thank all of those who've shown up on Zoom today. I'd also say I wrote this essay with some trepidation, which is to say, I've been asked in the past to write about CUNY, and I've resisted. In part, one doesn't want to get into the hand that feeds you, as it were, or criticizing your own institution with many colleagues and friends. And obviously, these matters can be matters of some dispute and disagreement. Nonetheless, I agreed in this instance. In part, I think if we take the now cliche from Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's former chief of staff and mayor of Chicago, that we don't want to let a good crisis go to waste. So thinking in the midst of a crisis about what public higher education in general might look like going forward, and what CUNY in particular might do, is, I think, a worthwhile and important enterprise. That said, CUNY is obviously a really special place, and City College in particular. I've been here for 12 years, is very, very dear to my heart. It's not always the easiest place to work, and many people on this call who are colleagues and friends, I think probably share that view. On the other hand, it's also an enormously rewarding place to work, because City College and CUNY more broadly is this incredible engine of upward mobility for so many people, and so many people from New York City, and then from the larger, you could say, tri-state metro region, and even from further afield. It's really a global campus that spurs this activity, and that's really what is probably, I'd say, this singular calling card that CUNY has, is this upward social mobility function. Many people have quoted, and it's now become a major talking point. I cited in my article the work by Raj Chetty at Harvard, showing how much CUNY in general does for upward mobility, moving kids who come in from the lower rungs of the economic ladder to the higher rungs and the upper class, and even further later in life. And there's been a number of other studies by the Brookings Institution that confirm that. So in a sense, that just gateway to opportunity is so central, I think, to CUNY. And it's also really central, I'd say, on the diversity point. Now, people celebrate diversity, of course, in its own right, as a worthy and noble thing. But really, diversity can also be a hard thing to manage in a society. And we've certainly seen that this past summer. Diversity can be difficult. And we've seen that over debates about immigration policy and so on. So if we're going to make diversity work, we need to have a sort of distribution of the diversity of society across all rungs and ladders of society. And if that's going to happen, we're going to really need institutions like CUNY to be moving people from different places in society into other roles and into different socioeconomic status. Otherwise, if people end up in some, say, segregated economically, regionally, racially, society is going to be in for a lot of trouble. And so I think CUNY really, for the city in general, for the nation at large, has an enormously important role to play.
Thank you so much, Dan, for starting that off and setting the tone for this conversation. What are the current and future challenges of CUNY as you see them?
Wow. Well, the current challenge is clearly, as you mentioned, financial. And this is not just unique to CUNY or unique to all public higher ed in New York State, or to it's a challenge that's facing higher education across the board in different ways. And let's just stick for a moment with the public side of higher education. The traditional model, you could say, of large state subsidies and low tuition, and that's the basic financial model across for state systems across the United States, has been under severe strain even before the pandemic, right? Meaning states have been reducing the amount of subsidies and either raising tuition or seeking greater philanthropic contributions from the private sector. So that model has really been under severe strain, and you could say the pandemic has made that model even more fragile than it already was. And so figuring a way out of that is, I think, the most pressing challenge that people's minds should be concentrated on. And we can bore down more into the details of what that might look like.
Great. And, just to help us all contextualize, right? We are, as you kind of state, we're in a different place now. And our institution, CUNY, is in a different place than where it was generations ago, right? Whether it was post-World War or the financial crisis of the 1990s, we are now in a post-COVID-19 era. You kind of put forth or present, that kind of means that we should be going after, private sources of funding and private financing to help continue to support this mission. I think there's tension there, right? When you talk about the privatization of higher education, right? It's like just kind of like an undercurrent, right? That introduce some controversy to this topic, because I think there's a very real concern that private financing of our public education system will only reinforce some of the systemic issues that we are battling. And that our social mobility does, it's such a great opportunity for us to confront some of the systemic issues. How do you kind of respond to folks who think that's a third rail, right? The privatization of higher education.
I guess I would start by saying, and this may be a source of contention, actually, I'm sure it will be, that in a sense, the facts of the situation have to be faced kind of unblinkingly if we want to do something better to improve and to set up public higher education in general, and CUNY in particular, for future success. The reality is that older model, generous state subsidies and low tuition, worked well, you could say, in the post-war period. You had a baby boom, more people going to college, that meant more enrollment revenue. You had state budgets were under much less pressure then. For example, Medicaid didn't even exist. In the New York context, Medicaid is just a huge part of the state budget. Now, one could say, well, we should cut back on Medicaid and fund public higher ed. That's a tough trade-off. And I'm sure your students in the public policy program can get into thinking about whether healthcare for low-income individuals is more important than public higher ed, or which one, or how to balance those things. Now, the other things are, K-12 education is much more expensive today than it was in the post-war period. Public, states and localities are on the hook for much higher pension obligations and funding than they were in the post-war period. All of these are just to say there's just a lot more pressure on state budgets than there was in, you could say, the Holocauste days of the post-war period. That's a sort of, it seems to me, a situational fact. In CUNY's context in particular, one could say you're very fortunate. CUNY, in some ways, is an outlier in terms of the amount of state subsidy it still receives, meaning it receives much higher state subsidies and has much, much lower tuition than really almost any other state university system across the country. So the sort of starting point here is not that even if state funding has slightly declined over the last 2 decades, that it is, far lower than other places. So in comparative perspective, your starting position is one of still higher state subsidies and still much lower tuition. So that would sort of be one way to start to think about that. And I guess last and most controversially, there's often it's the faculty union's talking point. It's a common statement that, well, we should just tax the rich to fund CUNY and that will solve all of our problems. I give a few points of data in the essay, and I can elaborate a little bit more about why I think that is unlikely to be a silver bullet solution, and that deeper, harder, more serious thinking is going to have to be done, because it becomes a kind of simplistic solution. We just tax them more. It's a solution for all seasons, whether times are good or bad. We should just tax the rich more and fund public higher ed. And I think that that's just too simplistic, and you're going to have to dig a little deeper.
Sure. Thank you for this perspective, Dan. And if I could take some liberty to maybe challenge that perspective just slightly, and I hope not to get too philosophical here, but does the change in does the source of funding change the responsibility of our local and state governments in investing in the future of its people?
I wouldn't say that it changes it. They still have a responsibility to doing that, but it's what these institutions can and want to do. If you want to have simply the responsibility to be all on the state's shoulders, well, then some cutting or trimming is going to happen, because there simply isn't going to be this magic silver bullet of increased state revenue. So you could say that the state can remain responsible, but you will have a more impoverished university. What I don't want is that. I want to continue to have CUNY grow, and growing seems to me to follow the path, or some of the paths that have been suggested by what's been done in other states. Again, it's helpful to look in comparative perspective rather than look at some idealized model, right? Some perfect solution, right? And compare ourselves to that and then say we're failing and doing terribly. My view is to look comparatively. What are other state systems doing? What are other places doing that could create efficiencies for us, that could help our students do better, right? Succeed in the future, right? I think I mentioned a couple little examples, in the essay. Arizona State made a partnership with Starbucks. Students who work 20 hours a week had their tuition paid for, right? And well, that would be good both for the students, because they would have tuition for free, in effect, in exchange for working, and they would get the experience of having a job. That's all good. That's, in a sense, a twofer. New York City is obviously not Tempe, Arizona. There should seem to me to be many more opportunities to make partnerships with businesses, with nonprofits, with other organizations here in New York that could spur our students, maintain high enrollments, and that would, in some sense, even allow perhaps some movement of increasing tuition, which would, in a sense, help the financial picture.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that, because I think about, obviously my role in the MPA program and what I see generally in the Columbine School and at City College and CUNY, where there is a tremendous amount of energy and movement towards building really deep, lasting relationships with private actors, with private institutions and companies who want to employ our students who are the future workforce of New York City. And so, I think many folks do recognize, myself included, the usefulness and the bright spot of opportunity that offers an institution like CUNY. I guess one of the questions that kind of, I'll raise to you is, who leads this kind of effort? Who leads this charge in terms of thinking anew about how we connect with our New York City ecosystem?
Well, that's a tough challenge for CUNY as an institution. CUNY is a very big, very complex institution, right? A great case study for your public administration students, right? And this is perhaps one of its big challenges, is you have all of these individual colleges. City College by itself is a big, complex institution. A college has 13,000 students. That's almost the size of, you could say, the flagship university of the whole state of Delaware, our president's home state. It has 16,000 students. That's the flagship school, right? City College is just one piece of the other 10 senior colleges in the system of CUNY. So we have a whole university structure right here at City College, but then on top of that, you have the CUNY central administration. And there's lots of mistrust between people at the various colleges and the people at CUNY Central about who is responsible for what and whose job it is to spearhead these partnerships. Is it the college presidents? Is it the top vice presidents and the chancellor at CUNY? And it's not clear. So you have a very top-heavy structure, right? Should some of these responsibilities be pushed down to deans, like our current dean, who's incredibly energetic and innovative and is trying to do a lot of the things that I'm suggesting? Is that a role or responsibility of deans or department chairs or program directors like yourself? And the truth is, one model could be to make CUNY even more centralized, right? And really put they already have all the power at CUNY Central, put all the responsibility there in a sense too. One other model might be to decentralize CUNY a little bit and give more power and responsibility to each institution as a separate institution, right? And you can look at models for universities that work like that around the world and in this country. You could say Wayne State University around Detroit does something like that. University College London in England would be a similar kind of situation or model that could look to where each of the colleges in the system are fairly independent, and responsibility is then decentralized to them to make a lot of these decisions. So that could be another direction you could go.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, I guess, and I will want to just turn to the audience to remind folks to please share questions in the chat so that we can pull and introduce them to the conversation. What you were just describing, right? The potential approaches of a more centralized CUNY and a more decentralized CUNY in the competitive environment that is New York City, right? In the very capitalistic environment that is America and New York City. Do you think that a scenario where CUNY decentralizes further or decentralizes power, do you see that within the larger context of our economic system of actually putting CUNY in a position where there might be winners and losers, where different colleges or universities have access issues of access to some of these private funds?
Yeah, I'm okay with that. In short, I think you could say one possible line of criticism of the current arrangements is that a lot of the centralization of CUNY over the last 2 decades has led to a kind of one-size-fits-all set of policies that each college or each institution there's a tendency to try to make them be all things to all people, right? And each one to kind of be mirrors in some ways of the other. Every college has to have a school of education. We have to have, the Center for Worker Education and the School of Professional Studies in CUNY, right? We have to, so in that sense, in my view, some of that diversity would be okay, which is to say you could create various centers of excellence, and different colleges and schools would be maybe more specialized in certain things and appeal to different kinds of students, and allowing in that sense a kind of institutional diversity to flourish. might be certainly welcome. So I guess from my point of view, that doesn't seem like a unworthwhile experiment.
Yeah, I think that probably will raise some controversy, because I think we are trying to achieve a greater sense of equity, right, in the CUNY universe, right? And so I think whatever approaches we take as a collective needs to take into account the certain trade-offs and pitfalls. One thread I want to pull from the chat, just because I think it would be interesting, is there's a question raised about this value of thinking comparatively, and if you can speak to the benefits and or pitfalls of kind of comparing CUNY to SUNY, to another system within the state of New York.
Yeah, I think thinking comparatively, one could start by comparing SUNY to CUNY. And there, in some sense, SUNY shows that a sort of more decentralized model can be successful. So SUNY was more centralized. It also decentralized and has given more power to each individual campus. It's also, in some sense, created a little bit more, and this exists inside CUNY too, but a little bit a sort of set of ranks of colleges, right? Some are seen as more prestigious than others, and some are able to do more or do things differently than others. And that exists already inside CUNY, but SUNY, you could say, has gone further in that direction. Obviously, if you take a broader comparative perspective, New York State's public higher ed system, doesn't look anything like, you could say, other states where you have a big single flagship university that's really the best one. And then there are various satellite campuses, take like University of Wisconsin-Madison or any of the kind of Big Ten schools. Or you have a two-tier system like California. You have the top UCLA and the others, Berkeley. And then you have the Cal State system, which is seen as less prestigious, offers more access. And that's a kind of two-tiered system. In CUNY, in some ways, you have kind of none of those things. People talk about City College as being the flagship school of CUNY, but there's absolutely nothing, as far as I can tell, in policy terms, done by the state or by CUNY Central to make it so. Right? Most of that is simply a reputational effect. So I guess I would be more favorable to trying some things like along those lines.
That's great. I think actually at this point, I would love to pause our back and forth and see if we've got some questions. I see that there's some in the chat. I would like to turn to Debbie if she's open to introducing a question or two.
Sure. So why don't we start off with Sherry, who I believe is a student at the Colin Powell School. Sherry, you want to ask your questions?
Yes. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for doing this. I guess what I'm probably most, I have a lot of things I want to talk about, ask, but probably if I was to ask one, I would love for you to, or Daniel, for you to expand why you think taxing the wealthy is a simplistic approach. For me, when I think wealthy, I also think corporations. So for instance, you look at a corporation like Amazon, and attached to that is Jeff Bezos. And I was just reading yesterday in The Guardian that, Bernie Sanders is on fire about pushing the minimum wage to $15. And the Republicans are, of course, saying, no, that's going to hurt business. Well, so what? Bezos doesn't get multi-million-dollar bonus that year, and he doesn't get to pay taxes. So, there's a number of things that the wealthy do, like write-offs, and which brings down their profits, or they move their corporations to, say, Ireland, so that they can get out of paying taxes in the United States. Is there, like, taxing the wealthy more like what was in line, post-war, but also holding corporations that do business in the United States accountable for taxes, and having those also go into fueling an education for the public. January 6th wouldn't have happened the insurrection at the Capitol wouldn't have happened if we had an educated populace. So I'm curious to know why you think taxing the wealthy is simplistic.
Sure. I'm glad you asked that. This is obviously a controversial point on which, many people disagree. The faculty union, as I mentioned, strongly supports this position or policy, but it's also been unsuccessful over the last 30 years, one could argue. So, one can keep, banging their head into the wall, but it's not clear that that's going to provide a solution. Now, what's the reasons for that? Not only are state budgets under greater pressure, as I mentioned before, but when we're thinking about taxing the wealthy, we're really talking about state taxes. So that leaves aside some of your questions about federal taxation and things like that, right? Taxing companies, Amazon, wanted to come to New York, but oops, we rejected Amazon. I was sort of hoping we could get some philanthropic dollars out of Jeff Bezos, or at least his wife, who's shown a great willingness to give to not the typical institutions of higher education with her fortune, but New York kind of rejected Amazon, so that's a different story. So we're talking about state taxes. Now, you'll often read in the paper, Governor Cuomo, his budget director and CUNY alum, Robert Mujica, they're going to say, we can't raise taxes that much on higher earners in New York because they'll move to other states. That's certainly a concern, right? Florida has no income tax. Connecticut's top rate is about 5 percentage points lower than New York's, right? Which means in their thinking, if we tax the rich more and they're mobile, well, in fact, some of them may move. And as a result, we actually won't be getting any more revenue than we were previously getting, even with a higher rate, meaning a higher rate on fewer people doesn't yield that much. I don't think the mobility story is actually the biggest reason why they won't do that, or the best argument. Most of those very wealthy people in New York, and you have to remember that about 2% of New Yorkers pay about 40% of the income tax revenue already. So the bigger argument, and this is a little bit more complex or difficult, is the basic tax structure, meaning very wealthy people who mainly work in the securities industry and finance. Their incomes are heavily dependent on stock market performance, which very much follows business cycles and moves up and down. The problem is here that most tax experts think that you don't want to base all of your revenue on people whose incomes fluctuate a lot, because, and this gets maybe a little technical or complicated, because if you've studied your Keynes, it's a pro-cyclical policy, meaning when the economy does poorly, their incomes fall a lot, even though they remain very high. But as a result, tax revenue also falls just when the state needs the money the most. So in that sense, what people want in most tax structures is a broad and stable base. So it's not a wise policy to move forward with increasing revenues more, because you're creating this really top-heavy or unstable tax structure. And then I'd say the other big reason behind why taxing the rich more to finance CUNY is probably not going to yield what people want is, even in the current context of a Democratic supermajority in Albany, that probably will override Cuomo's veto. If he does veto, he's already signaled he's open to raising taxes on the wealthy in the current budget crisis. But raising taxes on the wealthy in the current crisis, should it happen in the spring legislative session, is likely to close existing budget gaps, not to provide new revenue. In addition, if you look at the legislative agenda of the Democratic progressives in Albany, they've got a lot of other things they want to do, and funding CUNY is not high on the list. So in that sense, I just don't think that you're just going to see as much revenue that would really transform CUNY coming from a sort of tax the rich policy.
So Dan, if I could push there, right? And I think it was, and I have an actual quote from, I believe it was Corey Rubin in an Atlantic piece earlier in the year about funding for public universities. And she states that essentially donors lavish elite colleges and universities with gifts of millions, even billions of dollars. Sometimes these donations fund opportunities for low-income students, but mostly they serve as tax deductible transfers to rich private institutions, depriving the public of much needed revenue, right? And so don't we have to think about taxing the rich, or don't we have to think about truly restructuring how society is structured when it comes to trying to achieve some kind of balance and fairness within the economic structure?
That's a much larger and wider debate about the federal tax structure and philanthropic giving in the United States. I guess in my view, if which would obviously require major changes in Washington, if CUNY wants to make good on this, they could and should capitalize more than they have on securing some of these donations for our schools. There'll still be a tax write-off if they're coming to us, rather than going to the Middleberries and the Swarthmores and the Harvards and the Princetons of the world. So I think CUNY has been very slow in moving towards securing greater financial contributions in terms of philanthropy over the last 20 or 30 years. It's in some ways, other public universities have moved much faster, and they come to New York to raise money from very wealthy people in New York. I think CUNY should be reaping that local harvest.
Fair point. Debbie, I would love to turn back to you to see what else do we have out of our audience.
Absolutely. So there's a related question from Adrian, who asks, along this comparative approach, most countries have public educational systems that are fully supported by the state, including our neighbors north and south. So does the US's approach have to do with the continuation of the neoliberal approach as we transition into a technocratic system? Wonder if you could share your thoughts on that, Dan.
I confess, I'm not sure I understand the last part fully, but I'll take the first part. Around the world, again, what is fully funded is obviously a contentious and unclear point, right? The Canadian system to the north is not radically different from our own, and looks, so I guess I'm not sure that provides such a terrific contrast. If I take France, which is a country I know a little bit more about and have experience with their universities, France has a very extensive public university system and a very small private university system in France. So really the state is the big actor, which is very common in France. It's not a federal system. Everything is run from Paris. But you have a really powerful two-tiered system, meaning you have the grandes écoles in Paris that are very prestigious, very well-funded. And then you have lots of the regional universities, which are in fact not very good. The French public education system does splendidly K through 12, but there's a lot of evidence, I think, to suggest that it's sort of basic, sort of middle tier public university is in fact not very well funded and not so great. So I'm not sure that that's a model that one wants to pursue either.
So I'd like to pick up where you were just leaving off there and see if we could maybe ground ourselves in New York City, right? This talk is about the future of New York City, right? And as you lay out in your piece, the vast majority of CUNY graduates stay here. They stay either in the city or they stay in New York, right? I think it's 70% in New York City, remain in New York City. I believe it's 80% who remain in New York State. And so what kind of future New York are we trying to build, right? If we are not finding ways to invest, right? Whether they be greater public financing, or it's going after the private dollars and really building long-lasting partnerships. What's the future that we're really building for?
Well, I think we're trying to do, in some ways, what we're already doing, right? We're not trying to totally reinvent the wheel here. I think what needs to come back into clearer focus, you could say, is the centrality of undergraduate education in all areas, both in, you could say, the sciences, the liberal arts, the technical or pre-professional schools like engineering and architecture, which we have such terrific programs at City College. And, in some ways, you could say, I guess my view would be CUNY needs to refocus on that. And that needs to be front and center of a private philanthropic enterprise, because when everyone is citing those upward mobility statistics, they're really talking about core undergraduate education. And I think that has to come back to being the central focus. CUNY Central can often get a little distracted with creating all kinds of new schools and new programs. It's a very long list of new programs that CUNY has created without much money behind them in the last 20 years, from a medical school to a school of public health, to a school of professional studies, to a new community college. So in that sense, I think focusing back on where's the real rubber meet the road for the upward mobility machine, and that's the core focus of undergraduate education, and linking that to the larger civic and economic aspects of New York. I think the chancellor his heart's in the right place. If you followed his speech that was covered the other day, has some ideas about this, and is pursuing some of these kind of partnerships with, business and arts organizations. But again, we need to push forward with that, and that's the kind of thing there's been a kind of reluctance to do this in the past.
Yeah, if I could just, I guess, share maybe some congruence there in my own thought process with the MPA program, for example, right? We're a professional studies program that really only cares about where we place our students, right? What jobs they have, what levels, increased levels of career progression are they able to achieve as a result of the education they get in our program. And that is all dependent on what the ecosystem is, right? Who are the employers? Are those skills that those employers need what we are imparting in our, into and onto our students? And I think that kind of brings us back to the question of, if you're talking about, drastic changes in potential inefficiencies and consolidation, you're likely also talking about reducing staffing models, right? And changing up the game that way. And so I wonder, how do we balance, or how would you propose that we balance those trade-offs of having to better equip our students and make connections in the real world, but also the challenge of maintaining a really robust faculty presence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in two ways, clearly a number of things levers are there to be pulled. Now, the trouble with pulling any lever is somebody's ox is going to get gored. And so that's always the hard thing that I'm sure you teach your public policy students, right? Every fact that's out there touches on some interest. And, so that's the hard thing that, policymakers, who have, a lot of my respect to what they do, politicians and senior administrators have to make these kinds of hard decisions. That's why they're paid more. That's why they have a lot of responsibilities. So those are hard decisions that one would have to make about. But the truth is, it's very rare that programs are disbanded or trimmed. I think what CUNY is already doing in many respects, and more resources could be devoted to it, is the core thing of undergraduate education. Meaning, political science students come to me and say, well, what can I do with a political science degree? And the first thing I tell them is, look, if you're not going to engineering or architecture, or one of the pre-professional schools, you can work in business, in government, in nonprofit organizations with your political science bachelor's degree. It's going to give you some core skills, right? That's going to be your ticket to entry. In the current labor market, you may need to go on to Bobby's MPA program to take that next step up in your career, right? And that's fairly common, but I always try to encourage the undergraduates to see that the bachelor's degree is in some ways the ticket to entry. You've got to start there, and you got to have those basic skills and the kind of core cultural knowledge and some technical knowledge too, if you can secure it, coming out of those undergraduate programs, right? Our English majors, I think are learning, to work well, to write creatively, and we don't have to necessarily say, well, you need to study how to write copy for an advertising firm. They're learning how to write crisply and clearly and creatively. And if they can get hooked up with working for an ad firm later, they're going to write terrific copy, and they'll learn that on the job.
Thanks so much for that, Dan. Debbie, I'm turning to you again to see if we've got something else from the audience.
Sure. So we have a set of questions around how we might better use some of the online capabilities we've unleashed this past year. And Dan, you've alluded to some of these in your article, and I wonder if you could talk more about, can the college experiment more with 4-week classes, Saturday classes, more compressed semesters to better coordinate with student work schedules? And what about certification programs that allow students to start working quickly and use certifications to earn credits towards college degrees?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Again, making the most out of a crisis situation. I think forcing us all online has seen both the problems and the prospects of doing so. I don't think all online, especially what we know about the socioeconomic profile of CUNY students, is going to work for everybody, right? We can't stay an online university and succeed for the long run. We're going to need to get back into the classroom. I desperately miss the classroom and students in the classroom. I even miss working in the North Academic Center, which is a terrible building on City College's campus. And I never thought I would say I missed it, but I do. Because I miss that human contact with students, which is really important for bringing some of the students who are, kind of just hanging on in college. And if you have that personal contact with them, it's going to make a big difference. That said, I think a bigger online footprint going forward is both likely because of the pandemic, and I think it really can help a lot of students, especially our students who have complex lives, complex schedules. So as chair of political science, we really weren't offering hardly anything online, 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think going forward, I want to be offering much more at different times of the day, maybe even early in the morning or in the evening, Saturday classes, as you mentioned. So I think that spurred, at least from the sort of low perch where I sit, to say that we need to be offering more of our students that. That could benefit the college in many ways by allowing enrollments to slightly trickle up and more tuition dollars to go with them, if you're not saying that every student is going to take all of their classes in person. Some of the other suggestions you mentioned, and here again, I think, this offering more summer classes, our winter term, we haven't exploited to the extent that we perhaps should in the past. And I think at least what I know locally at the Powell School, the dean and others have been on top of this, and we've done a lot. And I think that's been really valuable. And I expect that those initiatives will stay going forward. Of course, there's big barriers to real change to the structure, meaning students' students' financial aid is tied to the basic semester structure. So, and that comes a lot from the federal government or the state government. So bigger policy changes at higher levels would have to change to really try to exploit opportunities to better serve students and make things more flexible.
And Dan, if you could, so for me, some of this is novel, but what's not novel is the struggle of students, right? Because I've been there, right? We've all been there, and it is very real. And I think you're right in a sense of what a tremendous opportunity the online virtual environment provides us. But how do we meet the needs of our students? Our population, as you highlight, is incredibly diverse, not just in ethnic makeup, but in terms of age distribution and where they're actually at in their careers. And I'm including, of course, undergraduates in this situation. So how do we, kind of meet these varying diverse needs?
Well, I'd say two things that should be thought about here. One is CUNY is a fairly bureaucratic place. I think again in the teeth of the pandemic, things have been done to streamline and knock down some of these barriers that students encounter as they try to enroll for classes and figure out their schedules and get set up. And so I think some of these bureaucratic challenges of making policy decisions back at the level of the faculty and the administration, which are the two bodies primarily responsible for doing that, and of course CUNY Central up high, I think that's a sort of thing that has to, it's a never-ending struggle, but it's something that has to be focused on, is knocking down these barriers to getting students enrolled, getting them settled, getting them scheduled, getting them in the classes they need, and getting them through. I think on the other hand, offering some more online classes for someone who's caring for a family member or who's working, right, may not be able to make the trip to our Harlem campus from Queens or from Brooklyn or from Jersey City 4 days a week or something like that. So they'd say, well, I'm going to register for 2 classes in person, and I'm going to register for 2 online that I can do in the evening or early in the morning, or as Debbie suggested, on a Saturday. And I'm going to have that mix, and that's the kind of flexibility. Of course, I think students also need, and I think the Powell School has been very good on this, of adding new advising capabilities. Students also have to recognize, is online something that's going to work for them? It might work for their schedule, but is it going to work for them intellectually? Meaning, are they really going to pay attention, attend the sessions, do the work if they're not connected? And it's certainly no shame in my opinion. I some ways feel like I wouldn't be a great online student. I need to be there in the pressure of the professor, you know, tut-tutting, school-marmishly telling me to do my work. And you just have to figure out what kind of a student you are. And if it's that you want that you need in person, you're going to do better. You should do more in person and less online. So students have a responsibility here to think about who they are and what their needs are too.
Yeah, that it's a really great point. And this is not a counterpoint, but this is kind of the other interest group, which is faculty, right? How do we then ensure that we maintain integrity in our instructional mission in an online environment, right? That's very different than what the vast majority of faculty have been used to.
Yeah, again, I don't think it's for everyone, right? Just like online classes aren't for every student, and some are going to feel like they're just not going to do well. There's no shame in saying that, and just I would say the same thing for the faculty. And not every faculty member likes or wants to or is going to be good at teaching online. It's a skill I'm far from mastered. I have great trepidation about my course this spring semester of keeping students enlisted and, you know, engaged and so on. So some faculty, and I can see this already as department chair, are terrific at this. They really know how to exploit the online environment to come up with innovative assignments, get students listening to podcasts and lectures by other faculty at other universities on a certain topic that are terrific instead of a reading, really coming up with innovative things. But again, that takes work on the front end. Some people are going to be motivated to do that and others aren't. And faculty just should admit, well, I like it or I don't, and that's okay.
So there's a comment that just kind of entered the chat, and I think it's an interesting undercurrent to this context that we're talking about here. And it talks about, you know, kind of, you know, how can we ensure the stability of a system in departments where more than half of the courses are taught by underpaid part-time instructors, right? You know, would expanding Saturday evening or morning offerings put more pressure on an exploited instructor labor? And so, do you have any thoughts on kind of just, you know, this is a very real experience that bubbles up to the surface, and I think it's central to kind of the argument of how do we change.
Well, this is the great problem of higher education across the board. CUNY is far from unique in a kind of two-tier system of labor among faculty, full-time regular faculty, and adjuncts. Right, that's a common financial solution. The adjuncts are much less expensive than full professors. Right, so again, this gets us back to those tough financial trade-offs. You can hire more full professors, right, to offer the same number of courses, but you have to have more revenue from somewhere to do that. That means raising student tuition, securing more money from the state, or securing more philanthropic dollars. Somebody has to give on that question if you're going to try to pursue that course. Or another solution is just to say we can't offer as much as we thought we could if we want to reduce our dependence on adjunct labor, right? That's another solution. These are these kind of, when I say we have to get into this problem of looking at the facts unblinkingly, right? This is that life is about trade-offs. And, you know, so that I think is, you know, these tougher questions. I think it's unfortunate when students have all adjunct faculty and aren't anchored to some people that they see over and over. It's hard for them to get letters of recommendation and other things. So obviously there's problems. On the other side, you know, we have some really terrific adjuncts and who do heroic work. And again, you know, nobody is forced to teach a Saturday class or an evening class if they don't want to. I would never do that as chair, especially, you know, usually it's fairly consensual in what we do. So, you know, many of the adjuncts we have are also practitioners in political science who come, you know, have day jobs in a given area. But I realize this is a complex issue. For all the egalitarian pretensions of higher education, there is a deep inequality between the regular faculty and large adjunct labor.
No, I appreciate you sharing your perspective. Debbie, turning to you again, if there's anything else in the chat that you think should be surfaced in this conversation.
Yeah, so Dan, you talk about the bureaucratic challenges of CUNY Central and the CUNY system, which I'm sure we've all experienced to some extent. How do you imagine increased campus specialization without greater centralization? So there's this tension, right, between, you know, the increased decreased centralization and increased specialization. So generally, more autonomy for an institution means it shapes itself to stand on its own and needs to be well-rounded. Within CUNY, the mode of specializing, say engineering on one campus, arts on another, is usually part of this more central vision built on the vision of all campuses being part of a single university. So I wonder if you could respond to that, as well as this question of, you know, if you think there is too much redundancy across the CUNY system, is there a way to be more efficient across the system, or is that actually a bad idea? Because for one thing, it might mean reducing faculty and staff.
Well, there's a lot in that question. I guess I'm not sure I see the contradiction on the first. So there's really two questions. I don't see the contradiction on the first one, meaning decentralization would restore in some ways or give greater authority and responsibility to college presidents and provosts to make decisions about how to strike that balance between foregrounding, you could say, what they're really good at, while to say keeping some of the other things that they also do, meaning they're not going to become all one thing, but they don't have to try to be everything. And again, that's that kind of decision-making authority, I guess, as a sort of policy preference of mine, is decentralizing authority to people who are actually close to the ground and close to the people that they're going to serve. And that's helpful because they have a good perspective on what can realistically be achieved. So I guess on the first point, I'm not quite so sure. Creating efficiencies, of course, again, this goes back to that question. Some efficiencies might need to be created, right? That's obviously meaning that someone's sacred cow is likely to be gored. And those are hard decisions about, you know, which programs are really succeeding and should continue, which programs there are maybe too many of. You know, one just wonders, you know, how, like, just take the example of the School of Professional Studies and the Center for Worker Education at City College. I mean, it strikes me that those two programs are doing virtually the exact same thing. Now, maybe we need both of them, but I can't remember there ever being a sustained argument or discussion about whether we did or not. They were just created from on high. And there's a lot of things like that in CUNY.
Bobby, you want me to take the next one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So another question from the chat. It's difficult to raise funds from non-alumni and to compete with private colleges that have dozens of fundraisers and immense development budgets. So could you give more specifics on how you would expect CUNY to increase philanthropic support given these factors?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in raising money. You know, I leave that to others, but I think this is the avenue that needs to be pursued on those techniques. I think to start with, CUNY has a terrific story to tell, and it hasn't quite been telling that story. And it hasn't, again, this goes to where resources should be allocated to. Has CUNY really invested in building up development offices at the level of the colleges? Right? Maybe they are well understaffed compared to their competitors, but that would seem to me to be a rationale for building them up and making them, you know, and identifying people who are savvy and successful at raising philanthropic dollars. Not to say that we can't do it, but just to say we haven't really tried, and that means putting some resources into the effort.
Dan, thank you so much for that answer. And I think it's interesting because one of the, towards the end of your piece, I had a quote that I highlighted as, you know, kind of like, where's the rub? And you kind of outline it here. CUNY is essential to New York's rebirth post-pandemic insofar as each campus is a key city institution, providing economic anchors in every borough, right? And I think that's just like such an important little nut for us to kind of kind of close out with. So, as a kind of just a closing, remarks, that's where I think where we end is, how important CUNY and CUNY institutions are to their locality, right? To where they actually are, and the students and the faculty and the ecosystems that rely on CUNY. Is that kind of what you meant there?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, you think about our own neighborhood around City College in Harlem, in Hamilton Heights. There's lots of businesses surrounding the campus that really, serve hundreds and thousands of students every day and faculty every day for all kinds of things: lunch, food, dinner. So with that surrounding economy, around Convent and 138th Street look the same without City College. That said, CUNY has a huge footprint across the city. I mean, it owns over 300 properties. For those of you who follow this, some of these properties probably should be sold, and that would be a way of generating some revenue. Again, there's a bit of inefficiency in CUNY's big footprint across the city, but certainly these institutions, which are vital centers, whether that's Queens College or it's City College or Brooklyn College, they're real neighborhood anchors that no one wants to see go away.
Thank you so much, Dan. This has been a really robust discussion, and one, I appreciate everyone in the audience for sharing their perspectives. Thank you very much, Debbie, for being able to surface the various perspectives presented by our audience. And Dan, it was a pleasure to chat with you. I've not met you in person yet, but this will work, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
I did. It was terrific. I really appreciate all your questions, Bobby, Debbie, and especially those of you in the audience for your questions. It's an honor to be with you.
Great. Well, Andy, I kick it back over to you to offer any last remarks and close us out.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really just want to thank you. Dan, thank you for being willing to come together for this conversation. Bobby, thanks for excellent questions. And Debbie, for curating what we had in the chat. I think it's been a productive conversation. It's been a provocative one, and it's been a really important one. And as I said at the very beginning, this is a part of what we hope will be a series of conversations for us about the future of public higher education, but particularly the future of CUNY. And I hope you'll be a part of continuing this conversation with us. And if you have ideas for where to take the conversation, to let us know. Thank you for what has been a really productive chat space and a lot of questions and comments and discussion during the course of this. And I just want to wish everybody a very good start to this semester. And have a good day. Thank you.